let me read you a quick little bio that David has up on his website. David Carle grew up in Orange County, California, received his bachelor's degree from UC Davis in wildlife and fishery biology, and a master's degree from CSU Sacramento in recreation and parks administration. He was a ranger in California state parks for 27 years, including the Mendocino Coast, Hearts Castle, Auburn State Recreation Area in the gold country of the Sierra foothills, and the State Indian Museum in Sacramento. From 1982 to 2000 at the Mono Lake Tufa State Reserve, he shared the unit ranger position with his wife, participating in a long effort to protect the Eastern Sierra Inland Sea from the efforts of stream diversions to Los Angeles. Oops, I just moved my thing. I was letting somebody in. And go back. He taught biology and natural history courses for several years in the 1990s in Saracosa. Yeah, Saracosa. Yeah, Saracosa. I even looked it up before. Community College in Mammoth Lake. Served as the president of the Mono Basin Historical Society, and since January of 2021 as the president of the California State Parks Rangers Association. We had the pleasure of having David come to our Nevada YSN camp out about 10 days ago or so, and he gave this presentation to all of our young surveyors camping trip people, and we had a really good time, really great conversation. And so I asked David if he would jump on here just so we could kind of promote his book from a von Schmidt standpoint, and then just to kind of have this conversation recorded that goes along with David's book. And so I appreciate you jumping on today, David, and it was a great conversation. And then we got some really good Nevada surveyors on here, so it's going to be nice to put your research together with maybe some findings that these guys are finding on the ground up there. So I appreciate it. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the additional opportunity to do this.
Yeah, no, I love it.
Fun at the camp out the other day.
Yeah.
So this biography of von Schmidt, Alexei Waldemar von Schmidt, A.W. von Schmidt, is really a full life story. As much as we have information for him, but we're really going to start it when he's an adult, working in New York State, and hears about the gold discovery in California. And like so many people from the eastern part of the U.S. and from other countries, even he joined the gold rush to California. Von Schmidt, A.W. von Schmidt, came with his father and his brother. His father's name was Peter and his brother was Julius. His father was the man who had trained in Europe as a civil engineer and a surveyor, and had basically taught A.W. what he knew. But they were all going to come separately. So on this map here, A.W. did the long trip around the Horn up to San Francisco, and it was May of 1849 when he arrived in San Francisco. And then later his brother Julius would come through the steamboat system that would bring him down to Panama, and then cross the isthmus there, and then steamboat up to San Francisco. And eventually then the father, who was older, he was one of the oldest 49ers to arrive in San Francisco that year, and he actually had a stroke within a year, and within 5 years he'd passed away. But the adventure began that way, and like all of the 49ers, von Schmidt was going to, while von Schmidt was going to do a lot of other things, especially as a surveyor and an engineer, at first he was there to try to see if he could find gold himself. And he left his ship that brought him to San Francisco in the harbor. This picture that's on the left side of the screen here was actually one of a series of paintings done for a calendar by A.W.'s grandson, who became a famous illustrator, Harold von Schmidt. And if you look behind those men all coming forward into California, there's all these boats out there in the harbor. And that was what happened. In fact, eventually over 1,000 ships were just parked out there with where their crew, their officers, everybody had headed off to the gold country trying to find gold. And von Schmidt did that. And like most of them, he wasn't apparently real successful. The indications are he went to the Yuba River in the gold country. That would be north of Sacramento. And the only indications are really from stories from his family and some artifacts, little bags that he kept his gold in, and he talked about the discoveries on the Yuba River. But eventually he came back to San Francisco basically each winter. A lot of that happened where the rainy season would come and the gold country would be abandoned by men who basically were not able to keep working through the rainy season. And there he met and married his wife. They would raise a number of children. And this is him. This is what he looked like. Very handsome guy. One of the things that was going to be a big part of his future years, not a surveying thing, but the engineering projects he worked on, was a steam rotary pump that he and his brother had patented while they were back east. And this is a copy of an advertisement for it in New York City. And that was a big thing. It was a big device. It was brought in big crates. I think it's one reason he came on the ship around the Horn, and it became not very useful at first, but it would come in handy later. And his expertise in terms of steam engines got him a job when he gave up searching for gold. He became the master of one of the steamboats that was plying from the San Francisco Bay Area across the Sacramento San Joaquin River Delta to the inland cities that were the points at which the miners would head up into the gold country. So that would be Sacramento, the future capital of the state, and the town of Stockton to the south. So there's advertisements in the papers about how he was running on the schedule where you could get on his boat, go out to Stockton on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, and you could come back on Tuesday, Thursday, or Saturday. And he did that for a number of years and made some connections during those years that became important. One of them, I believe, the indications are that led to his first surveying job. The government was in the business of first of all, the little map over in the left side of this image, it shows that the shaded areas are areas where there were Mexican or Spanish land grants. And most of those were up and down the coast of California, but some were in the interior valleys, the Sacramento Valley especially. And they all were required to be proven in order to for the owners to continue to occupy that land. And in order to do that, they had to hire contracted surveyors, and von Schmidt became a government surveyor under contract. And the very first #1 survey was for this very important guy in the history of California, John Charles Fremont. His rancho, the Mariposa Rancho, was surveyed by von Schmidt. And if you can see down in the lower left corner of that picture, it says #1. Every one of these things after being surveyed had to go be for a court and a commission and be proven. So he did a number of these for and the landowners that he was working for were some of the real key rancho owners. A lot of them, the Americanos, the Americans who had come in during the era when it was still under Mexican control and had been granted land in the interior. Peter Lassen, he has a big name in California. There's Lassen National Park, Lassen Trail over the Sierra up in Northern California was one of the ways that people came into California across country. And this borders the Sacramento River. And von Schmidt's signatures on each one of these things I'm showing you here. This is the Bidwell. Bidwell is where the town of Chico today is. Again, touches on the Sacramento River, and another one of the surveys that he did. And for one of the big names in California, the gold discovery was at a mill owned by John Sutter. Sutter had been one of the very first outsiders granted land by the Mexican government in the interior. And this letter that's in the archives, in the UC Berkeley archives and out here, basically is Sutter pleading with von Schmidt to hurry up and finish the survey so that he could start doing things with his property, basically splitting it up and making some money off it, because he was incredibly in debt. So, he was saying basically, I hold you in the highest esteem, but would you hurry up and get going on this and get it done? So this is a look ahead a little bit. This is a map that was put together in 1858. Now, the statehood came to California in 1850, the year after the big 1849 gold rush. And of course, the gold rush was continuing, and that prompted the statehood. But by so the work that he started doing as a surveyor came around 1853 and onward. And by 1858, just looking at where you see the hatch marks, the sections identified here, those that are running down the middle of this image are in the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys. There's a big lake down at the south there called Tulare Lake. It was once the biggest lake in California. Now it's just farmland, it was drained. And over to the east, across that white section where there's nothing shown, that's because there's the Sierra Nevada out there, there's more sectioned land. And that was much of what you see there was work that von Schmidt would end up doing in various ways. And particularly the Eastern Sierra portion would come after 1855. But before that, he was working down on the San Joaquin and in that Tulare Lake Basin. And this is a pencil drawing from a man that he invited to join in. There's a self-portrait over here of Grayson. And I think that must be von Schmidt being indicated behind him there in the background. So Grayson was an interesting man, and one reason we know some of the stories about von Schmidt and the wildlife encounters and things that occurred and how he handled himself in those cases was from Grayson's writing. And but one reason he was interesting is that he was actually the leader of the party that left Missouri that would become the infamous or very famous Donner Party that after the group split apart, no longer under Grayson's leadership, that party that got trapped in the winter as they tried to cross the Sierra, was the Donner Party. And Grayson made it by coming a different route down through Oregon. And so interesting connection as a friend of von Schmidt's. But then comes 1855, and after doing quite a bit of work, and he would continue to do a lot of survey work across Northern California especially, and up into Oregon a little bit. In 1855, he secured a contract. The Mount Diablo baseline was the key point for all of these surveys to be related to. And it had been run at first where the first work was going on in the coast ranges and across the Sacramento Valley, but only as far as the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. And someone had to take on the job of crossing really what was more or less unknown country in terms of this line, this route across the Sierra. It was not going to be easy. There were easier routes. The people were coming through the Sierra over various passes, but not along this particular area. And so in 1855, he gets the contract. And of course, he must have done what research he could find about what might be expected. This is a 2 years earlier a map of California that was done with information from returned from a group of soldiers that had chased Indians out of what would be eventually known as Yosemite Valley. And here on this map, you see a name here, Indian Valley. It doesn't show that name yet. And they went over the Sierra, which are really not depicted very well at all here, little skinny mountain designations. And you see this large lake, Mono Lake, an inland sea. It's not, they weren't surveyors, and they did not not map makers in terms of anything other than just a very, very primitive. So there really wasn't any information here for von Schmidt. Some of the information from that same party by 1854 was used by this, and the only improvement here was, well, for one thing, right here in the dark, there's the word Yosemite, where the soldiers had given it that name based on words they heard from the Indians there. But the map of Mono Lake still doesn't look right. It does show some islands, and it does have some names for some creeks and features. They're all names of members of the dragoons, the mounted soldier party, and none of those have really stuck. And they don't provide anything that would have been helpful really to von Schmidt as to what to expect as he did this survey. So he begins in June of 1855, party of 12. He had 6 packers, a whole bunch of mules, and this typewritten summary is available, is typewritten, but in the archives you can look at the handwritten notes that basically have the same information. And I insert it here just to give you a feel about what they were doing. On the left there's this record of the chains that they were measuring and advancing, and they would go up a hill and down a hill. It was all in following a line eastward from the starting point. The starting point, by the way, was, if you're at all familiar with the California area, there's a town in the gold country called Sonora, and that was just north of the Mount Diablo baseline. And so that's where they began. And the interesting part is when you get into von Schmidt's descriptions of in his journal that accompanied the formal reports that were made to the government. One of the things he noted was that as he got up into the lower stretches of the Tuolumne River, what's known now as the Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne, a deep canyon, there were waterfalls that he described as being very beautiful. He drew this one picture. But that Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne was in places even down at the lower end, a good 500 feet deep, and forced him to move to offset his line. And then he did it a couple times, and eventually basically stuck to a line that paralleled the baseline, marking the route across about 5 miles south of the actual line. And then he would come back to it once he got into easier country out of the mountains. So there was an article written by a Yosemite journal here, one of the foresters in Yosemite National Park many years later, but basically describing that this very important thing happened, and hardly anybody was aware of it inside of the park. And there was this map accompanying it, which is really nearly impossible if you're not familiar with what's there to make out what's happening. So let me just improve that for you. The central line here that's dashed is the line of their travel, and then it jumps up as they return back to the baseline across this ovular shape that's the boundaries of Yosemite National Park. And so let me just show you, I think just trying to make a point here about how they really didn't have guides. They were going more or less following their directions they had to go, but they were going blindly. Every time they came up and over a ridge, it was something unknown and unexpected, and on the other side. And this is kind of how they experienced that traverse across Yosemite National Park. This is a little more familiar, easier to understand. For one thing, here's Yosemite Valley is right. Let's see, right here. I'm going to put my glasses on. I can read my own stuff here. This is Yosemite Valley. Yosemite Creek comes down and makes the very famous Yosemite waterfall. That's all part of the experience of Yosemite. So here's the route, the dashed line that von Schmidt's party was following. And over here, when it got up near the Sierra Crest, they really struggled because they were doing this. They started in June, and there was still a lot of snow to deal with in these higher passes. And they weren't trying to find the easiest route to mark a route that others would follow later. They were trying to follow a line. So this is actually the baseline. And one of the things about this Yosemite Creek and the relationship to Yosemite Valley is that von Schmidt told his family, this is a quote from his daughter, that he always thought that he may have been the first white man to look down from the top of the mountains into Yosemite Valley. He said what he told his crew was that we're going to stop here, even though it's only 11 o'clock, and I'm going to make a sketch of these beautiful falls. Well, we can't find a sketch, but this is the view from the top of the cliff looking down into Yosemite Valley, right next to Yosemite Falls and the creek that falls there. And perhaps this is true. There's a persistent legend that someone else, Joseph Walker, had crossed the Sierra from east to west and may have seen, looked down into Yosemite Valley. And I just put up down here title of a book by Scott Stein that was published now it's 7 years ago, basically refuting more or less by a really detailed look at the records from Walker that he probably crossed the Sierra north of Yosemite and never got that close to it. So maybe von Schmidt was right. And so they struggled, they continued on. When he got into the snow, he actually, his notes say that it almost became impossible to continue on, especially with the mules, the mule pack train to work with. But he finally reached the Sierra crest. And there he wrote this, and this view, since I'm from the east side in the Mono Lake Basin, and his praise of that view is one of the reasons I became interested in this whole effort. He talks about how the very perpendicular easterly ridge of the Sierra Nevada, but the view of the country in front of him was magnificent, the most beautiful I ever saw. So this picture is maybe not from the peak where he planted his equipment to take readings. This is Mount Dana, the summit of Mount Dana, looking east. Just south of there is another very large peak called Mount Gibbs. And I suspect that it was Gibbs that he was on top of. So they got to the crest. He got his party back together. They'd had to split up in different groups to get the mule train and versus those working with the compass and survey line. And they drop down and they're into this basin, the Mono Lake Basin. And so they were able to shift back to the baseline. And then immediately after they did that, within just a couple miles, they moved, jogged around again to get around the base of what's called the Mono Craters, volcanic range of peaks right there. And then from there, they've completed their project. They didn't know, nobody knew yet where the California-Nevada border was. So they stopped when they were told where they were told to stop. And then he did something very interesting, which is going to be important later. He was directed to move south, and he went south for about 70 miles. And that would, be a information that would help him in the next series of surveys that was going to happen. Mono Lake still doesn't quite look right. It looks closer to what its real shape is here, but that's because he hadn't yet done the surveys that were going to come, where they're going to actually identify the edges of Mono Lake at the time. So they had begun on June 5th. They, in 40 days, they surveyed 120 miles, and then that established where the baseline was for across the Sierra and the east side. And he made, in the next few years, starting with December of that very year and then on into the next 2 years, 5 trips across with crews that would do all of the townships, sectioning, the marking each of these corners, and also the meanders. And this becomes surprisingly important. There were 2 large bodies of water in this area, Mono Lake and Owens Lake. And he was directed to do the meanders to establish the edges of Mono Lake at those points in time. Why this matters is that a century later, the city of Los Angeles had come into the area and diverted 4 streams that fed this inland sea. had caused that lake to decline by half its volume, and a whole big effort to protect Mono Lake developed and to save Mono Lake. And in court, the questions were, well, does anybody really know what the natural lake's elevation was before the diversions happened late in the 20th century? And it turns out there was plenty of good information because von Schmidt had done these surveys. Lots of good information hiding in here. He marks dotted dashed line here and labeled Indian Trail. There's creeks that are some of the tributary creeks to Mono Lake. But also today, there's a big controversy over one that's not shown here at all. And that's interesting because some people like to think that this creek, Wilson Creek, was a natural drainage of importance. And it actually appears that it was that the water that flows there today is really something about what humans diverting things within the basin. So lots of things that were helpful to people who wanted to discuss all kinds of various issues. You know, he's doing all this work in an area where there are not yet any, because they hadn't done the surveys, there were not yet any land grants, there were not any ranches, there were not any gold strikes yet in 1855, 56, and not until after he was finished in 1857. And back home, he's got a wife and children. And unfortunately, the San Francisco paper, the Daily Evening Bulletin, had to print this correction of some information they had put out earlier that the whole team had been massacred. Why that rumor got started is hard to say, but you know, one of the parts of the story was trying to understand his family life too. That's one of the lines, if you will, that is his family lines, that is part of who he was and what he did. And this must have been really hard for his wife and family. Meanwhile, he's doing work, and although he did not get massacred by Indians, and he did not have any fights with Indians, he did have some tense moments. Now, the Native Americans, the Paiutes who live in the Mono Lake Basin, they call themselves the Kuzetica, they were related, close relations to the Indians who had been forced out of Yosemite Valley by the soldiers. And so they were tense. They were, you know, seeing these people coming in, doing something very strange, it must have seemed to them, you know, stitching back and forth across the landscape with equipment. But this day that von Schmidt describes in August of 1856, they got worried. They saw this hunting party, about 30 Indians, all armed with bows and arrows, quickly advancing on them. And so he circled up his mules, not a wagon train, but mules, and got ready to deal with whatever would happen next. And then, because he had already been working here now for a couple of years, he'd already established some relationship with the local people, and it turned out all right. They were able to get some of the portion of one of the antelope that had been killed in a trade for a saddle blanket. And it seems like von Schmidt, in all of the surveys he did, was able to basically, you know, deal with the tension that could have become violent in ways that allowed him to continue to do his work. And this applies also to when he did the California-Nevada border survey. One of in 1857, the surveys were continuing. By the way, he's working, you may have noticed, January and working in December. The reason that he could cross the Sierra and do this kind of surveying in those months is that there was a 4-year very severe drought going on, about from 1854 to 1858 or 9. And it allowed, instead of dealing with big snowpacks and basically impassable passes through the Sierra, it allowed them to work and drop down into the Mono Basin, which is at an elevation around Mono Lake around 7,000 feet in the valley floor, and then down into the Owens Valley, down into 5,000 feet, 4,000 feet. So anyway, some of the things he described are features we're familiar with today. An area where there's hot springs and this geyser called Casa Diablo. Today's it's a geothermal plant. And then he described, and he camped very near what we call Hot Creek today. And he described it as just a hell of a place, hot steam, brimstone mixed with hellfire and so forth. But he predicted that it would have a value in the future. And it actually is a popular tourist attraction today. And of course, that geothermal is happening. Another part of the work they did, he would go all the way south, down to the south end of the Owens Valley with the surveys. And he would work in more than one party. Sometimes under his direction, parties were coming in from the north. Sometimes they were coming up from the southern end of the Sierra and coming up northward. And it was the parties working up through the Owens Valley from the south that have documented some of the first documentation of California Indians using irrigation practices. Now, most across California that didn't happen. It happened here where there was abundant water in the valley, and it happened down by the Colorado River with different Indians there where they had that water and would turn water out and used it to grow food crops that they were interested in. So we see these notes about irrigated land in various locations. You see these plat maps where across the edges here, they weren't really documenting what was happening in the middles of these middle areas of the sections, but there's these lines which were identified as creeks in places or canals. They were actually kind of faulty labeling there, because what they were seeing were the irrigation canals that the Paiutes had developed in those particular locations. And that's of interest today, because their water is a big issue in this part of the world. Water issues about Los Angeles owning this land now and taking the water south to the city of LA. And the local Paiutes basically are making claims today about by going back and identifying where von Schmidt's maps indicate to look, that they actually were utilizing water, and it's part of a basis for perhaps a legal claim regarding water. So interesting what all of these things can lead to. So a couple of the pictures, before we started, some people were talking about different places you've seen. They had seen some of these corner markers that are, think about the number of years here now. This particular one here that I photographed was placed at a corner in 1857, July 5th, 1857. Today's 2022. So that's what, 140, wait a minute. I'm going to get the math. It's 155 years ago.
Yeah, 165. Yep.
Do my math. 165. Thank you. Yeah. And this marker is one that's not right anywhere where very many people will find it, which is maybe why we can say that it's in such pristine shape. And when I went there, I was with a couple of BLM surveyors, and they placed, one of them placed as the device on the top of this post, and it was within 6 feet of what his modern device was telling us in terms of latitude and longitude, and pretty accurate work. So 1857. By the way, that was one of the last ones placed in July of 1857. He wrapped up this work and moved on to some other projects. And it was in September that a gold strike happened in the northern part of the Mono Basin, and all of a sudden the ability to make land claims, if the Indians were worried about what this all meant, that it started to hit home as to what it was really happening here historically. So, and a few years later, the nation is in a civil war, and in California, the fighting never really turned into anything that was of importance to the war effort. But von Schmidt, as an engineer, was commissioned and served with the California State Militia. In 1856, before that, he got involved with projects to serve the city that was his home now, San Francisco. San Francisco really had a water crisis, and they needed to bring in water from outside the city. So this was a reservoir von Schmidt constructed, and aqueducts that ran north up the peninsula to San Francisco, about 25 miles of distance to in this project. And for that time, this was one of the first major projects to happen along those lines. Von Schmidt would work in the water project field in a number of ways over the years. And in fact, he was a dreamer. He was aware of Lake Tahoe, a very pristine freshwater lake up in the Sierra Crest. And he came up with this scheme and detailed plans to build a diversion, some tunneling involved to get through the Sierra, and then an aqueduct all the way to San Francisco. And while things like this were going to happen, he was way ahead of himself. It was 1864. He first proposed this. He kept on pushing it. He did some work up in the Tahoe area. He was still alive in 1900 and still pushing it, but that never happened. The projects that came later were within about another 30 years or so, and things did happen. Here's the dam that von Schmidt had constructed at the outlet to Lake Tahoe on the Truckee River, and he calculated how much he was going to raise the lake and how much water that would generate to take down his proposed aqueduct. This is that point today, and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation has a dam right on the von Schmidt site that is controlling the Truckee River. But the water that comes out of it is part of a project that was built to serve Nevada, and turns and drops out of the Sierra down to the Nevada side of things, and irrigates land, has been irrigating land now for a very long time. The Newlands project, one of the first U.S. Bureau of Reclamation projects there was. Von Schmidt was long gone by this time. Another one of the big projects he did, just quickly before we get back to surveying, was he built dry dock, the first dry dock on the West Coast. And it took advantage of, once you got a ship into these things, you would by driving them in when they're full of water, you would then close the gates and pump the water out. Well, those pumps were part of his expertise that he had developed way back when he was still a young man in New York, and just modifications every time he used them in different ways. So then he's becoming a very well-known guy and very respected. He was chosen as chief aide to the grand marshal of a big parade in San Francisco on the day that the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. And the word came, because he was at this point, a pretty important guy in San Francisco. Another big project that got him worldwide attention. It's amazing to realize, but there was a navigation rock just below the surface, a big island really, below the surface of the low tide off San Francisco, in the bay, and he got a contract to blow it up and to solve that problem, to lower its ships could get through there. This was the day that he did the big excavation, and which involved pumping water again, by the way, to do the work. And then they blew it up. Von Schmidt is the guy here with the X, and next to him marked with an E is his son Edward, a teenager, about 17 years old. He was gonna, within a year, he was gonna be off helping his father on the survey of the California-Nevada line, and other workers who did this work. And I say that it was really noticed that this is a New York journal that had a drawing. There were photographs of that moment of the big explosion, and it was noticed in the news in Europe and in Asia, that von Schmidt had done this amazing thing. So on to his very famous work on the California-Nevada boundary. When the Constitutional Convention that created the state was held, they there were all these different things about, well, where are the boundaries of the state going to be? The northern boundary was the Oregon border, which had already been established. So that was pretty straightforward. And then there was a lot of things to talk about. Well, just how far east is the California border going to be? And they decided to go with some round figures. So you see the longitude line that they're following in here to come down from the Oregon, turns a corner at the 39th degree of latitude, and then follows an oblique line down to the 35th degree of latitude, where it intersects with the middle of the Colorado River channel. And then down the Colorado River is the marker of the boundary until you get to Mexico. That all must have seemed pretty straightforward to those who made those decisions in the Constitution. But surveyors had to figure out what it really meant, and turned out there were some surprises along the way. 611 miles of distance when it came to the survey that was going to be done. And then I'll talk about the efforts that von Schmidt was faced with. But here's a map that came out in 1849 or in 1850, just as statehood was being declared. And I'll show you some detail here. That corner where the longitude line becomes the oblique line heading for the Colorado River. At the time, the folks doing this work thought that Lake Tahoe at that point was being given the name Bonpland, Lake Bonpland. Lake Tahoe, they thought, was going to be all entirely within California. They didn't realize that one of the surprises would be that it was bisected by this boundary line that they were following. So a number of government survey efforts began. One in 1861 during the Civil War. A crew was sent to establish that point at the 35-degree line at the Colorado River, and then try to start working the line northward or northwest, or north to the northwest. They were going across the driest desert portion of the California-Nevada borderline, and they didn't do well. They did well for about a month, and then they stopped finding water, and their escape was out to the west through Death Valley, and they came close to adding to the reason for that name, but they all made it out. They got to the Owens Valley. They actually used some camels on this effort. And the one thing they did do, I guess, besides establishing the point on the Colorado River, is they developed some information that would be useful to future surveyors trying to cover that same line. So as the years went by, there were some issues that really were driving the need for a really final survey. One was a little war that started up in the Honey Lake Valley, where near the town of Susanville, where the people around Honey Lake thought they were in the Nevada territory and not in California, and they resented the county officials, Plymouth County, coming in and trying to enforce law and collect taxes. And so there was a shootout that nobody got killed. A couple people got wounded. And then the letters to the government were, we really got to get this resolved. Let's clear that up. So that needed to be done. And then another big question was, what about the town of Aurora, which is marked with the green arrow here? This Aurora was serving as the county seat of Mono County, as a California county. But since no one was quite sure just where the boundary line was, it was also serving as the county seat of the Nevada side, and people were voting in both two different elections, and it was a mess. It needed to be resolved. So in 1863, still during the Civil War, the survey, named for two surveyors and eyes, began from the Oregon border, came down to Tahoe. By then they had already determined that the line was in Tahoe and that they would turn a corner out in the lake. They determined, they clarified that Honey Lake and that whole valley was in California, and part of, and a new county was formed because the people were really mad at Plymouth County. They call it Lassen County. And then they began down this oblique line And the direction they were headed had been determined by the findings down at the Colorado River, and that was the point they were going to be aiming for from where they were up at Tahoe. They got as far as past Aurora and into the edges of the Mono Lake Basin, and they ran into a big, what would be known later as an annual gathering of local Indians, maybe 500 of them, Pine Nut Festival. And the Indians were camped right on the line, and there was some tension, and it was getting late in the year. It was October. Finally, the surveyors decided, okay, enough for this year. We're not going to force our way through this potential mess with the Indians. They turned around and started to head back up, and as soon as they turned around, a big early winter storm arrived, and almost it didn't kill any of them, but a whole bunch of them they were not prepared for snowy weather, frostbite problems, and anyway, they had to retreat. And then they were never funded to finish. The governors involved, the territory of Nevada and of California, tried to seek funding, but they were never, not, the legislatures wouldn't give it. The two big issues had been resolved. Maybe that was why they weren't getting nothing. It was still the war years. But anyway, the rest of the line remained to be dealt with. So too far. Go back. Wanted to show you the cover. So in 1872, now we're 9 years later, Alexi W. von Schmidt got the contract from the government. The land office was being run at the time by Willis Drummond. And this is the cover of the first year of work. The first year was the Oregon down to Lake Tahoe year in 1872. And this particular booklet is really wonderful to leaf through. It is in the archives at UC Berkeley again. So right in one of the very first pages, von Schmidt draws a picture, a pencil drawing of the marker that they placed at this monument at the corner of the Oregon line and the beginning of where they would start going south. This is a photo I took off the internet. I haven't been to this site yet. It's remote. It's not right next to any given road, and I need to get up there to see it, to see if it still looks this good like this. But here's part of the challenges that von Schmidt had to face. He had been directed by Drummond, by his boss in Washington, D.C., to begin his work at Major's Corner. So Major had in 1868 been working along the Oregon line, the Oregon boundary with California, and had established that his estimate was that this line, this point that marked the corner of the eastern corner of California was in this particular location. It was a correction for the Houghton Ives survey point, which was a good 2.4 miles off to the east from there. And you see there's another line here that's the von Schmidt corner. So von Schmidt started, by this time the railroad and the telegraph were available, and down by Truckee and Verdi, it was possible to be much more accurate with timekeeping to do the longitude determination. So von Schmidt took that information that had been developed down there, and he started north, and he realized Major's Corner was not the proper line. And he actually telegraphed back for instructions back and was told, well, you can follow that line you're following if you wish from the south up to the Oregon line, but you must follow Major's Corner. If you go with, over here is where von Schmidt would end up going. And they basically were stuck on this idea that Major's Corner was the starting point for his survey and he should follow directions. And von Schmidt basically said, I can't do that. It won't be accurate. And so he shifted to and marked that marker I just showed you a picture of, and started the southward survey. And it took him a while to get paid, by the way, after disobeying his bosses, but he eventually did. And along the way, he would, as he did this survey work, he would place not just corner markers, but for townships, but he would also place some. Actually, he was supposed to mark every mile, but he also placed some iron markers. This one was, they were cast in the Bay Area and brought in by railroad in this case, because he was not far from this important railroad town of Verde here. And you can still see it. It's pretty well protected nowadays. For a long time, it was abandoned and getting vandalized, where some repair work was done on it. The four sides of these markers are interesting. They give the year, they give the longitude that he's following. They let you know that this is work done by A.W. von Schmidt, U.S. astronomer and surveyor. It says at the bottom of the middle there. The astronomer was put in there because now he's working on this longitude question, and it's part of his his work was to do the astronomical work necessary to make that happen. And it then tells how many miles he's come, 170 at this point, from Oregon. So more of these would be placed. Once he gets down to the North Shore of Lake Tahoe, he placed another marker, which has disappeared. I don't know where it is. I did my best to try to locate it. The land where it was placed became part of a casino at one point. But anyway, what he had to do at that was the end point of his first year of work. And then he would come back in 1873 and complete the work that would allow him to turn this corner in Lake Tahoe. They used boats out in the lake. They used signals from shore, including fire signals, to establish, where to turn the corner. And again, the point they're aiming for had been long since determined down at the Colorado River. But I love this picture. It's on a U.S. Forest Service trail display there at that point on the North Shore of Tahoe. And here we are coming off the southeastern shore at state line and you see four different lines. This is the Houghton Ives line of earlier years, and of course it's offset from where von Schmidt came because of what he felt was more accurate. And the other two lines are going to come later as corrections are made by the government to the von Schmidt line, and also corrections to that survey. So as the ability to be more and more accurate came along. But von Schmidt, the reason why there's an arrow here to let you know about the monuments that von Schmidt made on this side of the lake, these were granite and carved with information on them. This one was placed right where the arrow is near shore. One was placed where this road, wagon road, was running, and to mark that right along the wagon road. And a little bit of humor in von Schmidt's records. He talked about as they left Tahoe, the line went through the window of Mr. Lapham's house, through the house porch. Well, Lapham's house was a resort, and it ran right through his dining room there, and moved on. So little strange history here. This is the granite marker that was set on the Stagecoach Road. And you notice something interesting about it. Today, it's sitting, there's two interesting things. It sits outside of the Courthouse Museum in Genoa, Nevada, with absolutely no interpretation of what it is and why it's there. And it had started out up in near Lake Tahoe, but because of development, it got moved. It was for a while by the post office at South Lake Tahoe, but it wasn't a good spot for it. Apparently it was getting bumped by cars. And eventually someone brought it down here and put it by this museum. Notice the 1873, this is the year that von Schmidt's working now. but can you tell that it's been dug out? This marker was used by Houghton Ives, and that originally would have been 1863. So von Schmidt saved some money here with by just changing that. And I really wish some surveying group would take on the project of convincing this museum to do a good job of explaining what's going on here. I tried and told them about the book, and they basically were not interested. So whatever. So now we're going to go down the oblique line, and I want to just show you what they faced at this point. This is just to indicate some of the ups and downs and elevation changes. They're going to end up down near sea level in the Amargosa Desert. They're going to end up over 13,000 feet, going over the peaks of the White Mountains and all of these other ups and downs. Down they go, up they go, and marking all along the way, every mile with information on every marker. So a couple of modern satellite images I want to use to show you some things that are of interest. First of all, the line you see here is the corrected line that von Schmidt did not mark. His marking is a little bit offset, and I'll show you that in a moment. But where he came across was the middle of the peaks of the Three Sisters. These Three Sisters look like this from the highway out there in the Sweetwater Mountains. All along the way, they would dig a pit, they would fill it with ash, they would pile rocks if rocks were available. They had axemen that were part of the party. And this particular marker is at mile 294. This is measured from Oregon. And you can see Mono Lake off in the distance. So if you're in Levining or where I live by Mono Lake, the Nevada boundary is in sight out there off to the east. This is the next mile along, and again, these two are in really very good shape. There are roads very close, just over the other side of these bushes, but people don't seem to find them, and that's been good for them. On each side, each face was carved. You can see a little indication of Roman numerals that gave the numbers of where they were, how far they were from Oregon, which side was Nevada, California, and von Schmidt's name on those again. So von Schmidt made, after this was all done, he made two copies of a very detailed, very big map of the whole boundary. And this thing is a segment, this photo is a piece of something that's 8 feet long. And in order to see it, one of them is back in the National Archives, and one of them is in the library in Berkeley. In order to see it, they bring it out, they lay it across the table, and then I was allowed to take these, section photographs of it. Very difficult to photograph the whole thing. So here we are. This is Aurora. You may remember that town that was in California because earlier survey by Ives actually had stopped right about where this arrow is. That's right about where a modern highway is, and it also marks where at that time. So it's 1873, right? So by now the gold towns like Aurora and Bodie were starting to be something. Aurora was the big one. Bodie was yet to happen really big. So there's a stage road indicated right here, and it's going to Benton. It comes all the way down and goes over here and heading over to the California town of Benton. It's just off the map. And here's the kind of information that's in the records that von Schmidt kept about, and here's this reference to that particular road and how they marked with a juniper post and all of the details about it. Uh-oh, my computer's giving me an error message. And so here's one of the other markers from in that same area, that portion. And in this case, there's no rocks. There weren't any rocks around right here. It was just sandy soil. And so they went with the juniper posts and marked it. But whatever they had to use was how they would work on the marking. Today, if you look at some of the topographic maps that are out, the corrected line, we'll talk about how that came about, and the von Schmidt line are shown. And in this location, they're not very far apart. They cross at a certain point. All of that's part of the something about the corrections. But take a look at this. So here's a international forest map. And here we are, it's showing Esmeralda County in Nevada along the current accepted line, and they're still showing the von Schmidt line out here. And one of the things I wanted to show you here is what happened with Boundary Peak. So Nevadans are proud of Boundary Peak, 13,000 foot peak that's in the tallest peak in Nevada. And when von Schmidt surveyed, it was in California, or very close to the boundary, right on it. And so that was one of those changes that happened as the history played out here. Way farther south now, as we get down into the desert, this is the Amargosa Valley, and Death Valley is off these roads going off the scene. There's that line again. Take a look at this section of the map that von Schmidt did, and look at the topographic relief. I'm going to back it up right here and over here. See how he drew that and labeled it. This is part of this relationship I think that he had that was pretty good with learning things and talking with and being part of, aware of what was happening with the local Indians. These are Indian names, Chung Up Mountain, which he translates as the mountains without water, and over here the No Wahat. So he was talking to the people who were living out in this desert, who were by this time in the 1870s, with all of the gold rush stuff that had happened and all the disease issues that had happened, things had really gotten very tough for those Indians. By the way, I should mention that when that other incident I mentioned about not sure what was going to happen with the Indians, they didn't have soldiers along. They carried, the record says that that day he had a shotgun and 2 rifles with their party, and that was it. And so he really was not in a position to be forcing his way through this countryside. These people had lived for so long. So in his journal, he talks about out there in the desert crossing that there was not a living thing to be met, but a few horned rattlesnakes, horned frogs, and lizards, and horny toads, we call them. And finally, after carrying their water across the final portion that had defeated the surveyors who tried to go across this section in the past, carrying it in barrels on their mules, he arrives and he ends up, he's been aiming for this point, Ives Point, that had been established back in the 1860s. And he ended up a 1/4 mile from it, which is, I think, pretty amazing. But at this point, the river had shifted. Colorado River is about 1 mile wide. These are the boundaries at that time as it was drawn. And the river plays around between these banks. And von Schmidt had a decision to make about, there was correction needed to be done to remark and work his way back towards where he'd come from. But the question is, from where? And so he asks for direction from Washington, and he's told, you will go with the Colorado River Point mid-channel as you see it today, and its intersection with the 35-degree latitude line. So that meant 1.5 miles of correction, and a very different thing to face, going back across that incredibly difficult desert environment and moving every single one of the mile markers it did. And so in the years to follow, this diagram was part of a report that was put out, and it needs to be, I'm glad I was able to do this in the book. It's grossly exaggerated about just how far off von Schmidt was from the correct line. What the marks where he should have gone back towards Lake Tahoe, they suggest he was given information about what headings to use, and it actually brought him back until he intersected his own line, which was not supposed to happen. He was supposed to be moving west of it. And so here's my point: to look at in a report something in this kind of size diagram, maybe about 6 inches across the page, maybe 7. This total distance is 400 miles. About the offset that von Schmidt had to do was 1.5 miles, and at this scale, it should have been drawn at less than 23 thousandths of an inch in order to depict 1.5 miles and 400 miles at a proper scale. So he was off, and there was a bend in the line, but it wasn't this kind of a bend. It was a much more subtle thing. And the corrected survey that finally identified the problem and then created a survey that would be acceptable happened in the 1890s. So a lot of years went by, 20 years before it was even identified that there was a problem. They first identified the points up at Tahoe and at the Colorado River as being off, and then with new information, new equipment, and then found the bend in von Schmidt's line, and they took 6 years to complete what von Schmidt did in 2. So at the Colorado River today, you can find another one of the cast iron markers that von Schmidt left. The river undercut it, and it was on the bank, and it ended up in the river, rescued it, and it plopped it down. And it's again not in a place that von Schmidt placed it. There are these historic displays that explain some of what happened and what went on. And it's an interesting thing to go see, not too far from Las Vegas and Needles and those towns out there. So quickly, just there was the rest of the story for von Schmidt after he completed. By the way, the pay, if you adjust it for inflation, that he got for this work was probably around $1 million. He had to pay all expenses out of his own pocket for his crews and his food and everything. But he made good money out of this. So he's still continuing to do projects that took him up and down the state. And one day he was in a Wells Fargo stagecoach that got robbed, and he broke up the robbery. He stepped out of the backside of the stagecoach and drew down on the robber who fled, and the Wells Fargo people gave him this very engraved watch in honor of what he had done for them. And he just said, we needed to get going, and I wasn't going to let that happen when I had a gun on me. So he was an interesting pioneer. These are some of his children. Walter, as a young man, was captaining ships and was on a ship up off Alaska and died at sea. Lily is his daughter, and she married, and her first husband died, and then she married Charles Tilden, who's a big name in the Bay Area. And there's a Tilden Park and regional park, and they lived in Alameda across from San Francisco. Alfred, another son, ran a vineyard that the family owned in Fresno. And this guy, Edward, was the oldest son. He became a ship's captain. And then eventually he ran A.W. von Schmidt's invention, this dredging machine that was used around the edges of San Francisco Bay. An example of this machine was used a type back east in the tidal basin in Washington, D.C. It was used down in San Diego near their harbor there. It was one of the ways that von Schmidt was making money from his skills still at that point. Edward, unfortunately, was a suicide late in life. And so his widowed children, von Schmidt's grandsons, were under his care late in his life. He's 80 years old in this picture, living in Alameda, not far from where his daughter lived at this point. Von Schmidt died within a month of the big 1906 earthquake and the devastating fire that devastated San Francisco. He had done so much to be part of that town, and as an elderly guy, he never got back over to see what had happened there. He did get reports that all of his records that were still in his office in San Francisco had burned, had been destroyed. So a lot of what we would like to know about von Schmidt, it's amazing how much we've got from family archives and the government archives of his reports. And I'm glad we have some of his voice in the things he wrote. So the book is a biography. It's not just a survey biography. It's all about his lines across the land, his water lines, and his family lines. And I'd be happy to take questions. I think probably that to do that, I need to stop sharing and turn my video back on. So thank you for letting me tell you the story. And I'm going to turn my video on so I don't have to look at that funny picture of me. There I am.
I love it. I love the history, and I love how much in depth you went on the research side of it. It's fantastic. And even, from the non-surveyor side of things, it's just a great story. So I don't know if anybody wants to kind of add in or even just ask questions, but if I'm sure some of you guys that follow Steve for sure, I'm sure you got some stuff to add, Steve, to some of that, or no?
David, this is Steve Parrish again. I've never seen it confirmed, but the one monument that was placed, a metal monument on the north end of Lake Tahoe, I understand ended up in the Hills Brothers property and not on the line. So there's another one there. I've never actually, of course, you don't get in on the Hills Brothers property to, to prove it, but that's the story that I've heard for years.
That's good information. I didn't know that. I hadn't heard that. The Hills Brothers property, is that I know there's a casino that's on the property just up from that point. Is that or is it something else?
Yeah, I'm not sure even where the Hills Brothers, I don't know if anybody else here from Nevada area has any more information. I've never really looked it up.
Okay. It'd be nice if it was publicly displayed and explained.
And then the next monument down from Verdi that you were showing there that was all caged in there, that falls down by a railroad track down by the Truckee River, and it had fallen over. And between John Willits, we weren't too sure if it had been put back in the right place. I've got some pictures of myself and my granddaughter standing by that one, and it was leaning pretty heavily there in a sandbank.
I'd heard about one of them there where the train tracks got expanded and had been taken out by the train company, perhaps. Yeah. So yeah, interesting.
I did in the chat. I went and grabbed the first part of the John Willits article for the professional surveyors. I went and grabbed that one. I was trying to find the other ones while you were chatting as well, but I threw the archive part of that in the chat. So I'll go find the rest of them. I'll find some more of John's stuff and throw it when I do the follow-up email. But
yeah, by that I should say that the Government Land Office folks and the National Archives folks were very helpful. I was able to get CDs with all of the, focused on specifically on von Schmidt's, work. And then I was able to, one of the best things though was to be able to get away from the kind of dry records to the descriptive records that he kept as he was doing these surveys.
That's awesome. Go for it, George.
Back in the 70s, I did a survey for the Calneva Casino up at Lake Tahoe, which by itself has a pretty colorful history too, because of all the Sinatras and supposed gangsters that were cruising around there. But one of the interesting things about doing that survey is we knew that the state line ran along the west side of that property. However, the hotel pool had the state line in the bottom of it, so you could swim across the line even though there was nowhere near it. But I'm sure a lot of people were fooled by that. I don't know who laid out that one.
I've seen the photograph of the swimming pool with the state line painted on the bottom across the pool. Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, and my understanding about the various court decisions about where the line would be settled as this other information was developed was that they decided not to go with the Oregon to Tahoe segment as it was, recognizing that it wasn't perfect, that it wasn't totally accurate, but in part because if it had shifted, it would have put some, back in the day when we didn't have casinos in California, it would have shifted some casinos from the Nevada side to the California side to adjust it. And
have you been able to talk to a gentleman by the name of Bruce Thompson? He was a judge here, and he very, very interested in the location of this line. In fact, back in the 70s and early 80s, he came to several of our local chapter survey meetings and talked about his knowledge about the case. He has done a great deal of research too. Be a good potential contact if you haven't found him. If he's even still alive.
I haven't talked to him, but yeah. I have not talked to him, no. But the rest of that story, there was the court decision was that they had to go with the corrected line on the oblique portion of the line, and because it was correct, and it didn't have those issues about pushing casinos into California.
That's awesome. George, who was the name that you said? Thompson?
Bruce Thompson.
Bruce Thompson?
Yeah.
He was a judge in Reno?
He was a judge in Reno. I don't know if he's even still alive.
Yeah.
He died several years ago, George. He was part of our Cannoneer group in that too, so.
That's too bad. We became pretty friendly for a number of years.
I know
he passed.
I know Mr. Kidd is trying to do a kind of a retracement on Von Schmidt stuff as well. He's doing a whole article. So I'll see if he can find any of that kind of stuff. But the canyoneering thing, that's a great conversation that you've had in the years past, Steve, about looking for the old cannon, right? Is that what that conversation?
The old cannon?
Yeah. Is that what
are you talking about? The Fremont cannon?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what Steve's had some great conversations about, the old Fremont cannon. Yeah.
If I might steal another private moment here, Dave, California, Nevada came up with a monument called the Von Schmidt Monument, an award. And I was the first recipient. I think there are Trent, 4 of them now, something like that.
Yep.
And this is the monument right here. There's
my gosh.
There's the California side. Of course, it looks backward on my screen.
Yeah.
There's the Nevada side, and it's got California land surveyors on one side on the bottom, and then it's got Nevada on the other, and then the dedication is the Von Schmidt Award. And so they handed this out to myself and 3 other recipients.
Yep.
And it's a real prize.
Cool. That is neat. The marker that I really need to go see in person, I don't know if any of you ever have, is up there at the Oregon, California line where Von Schmidt built that pretty big pile of rocks and a marker and did that nice drawing in his
a person that's got a lot of information on that is Paul Pace in Reno. And he, and then of course the late Bud Uzez and others have visited, and I'm not sure if they're the ones that put some of the concrete around it, but they've been up to that monument many times. Yeah, there's a picture you got there again. And I've never myself hiked up to that particular one. But Paul Pace has a ton of information on the monumentation of that one and its progression.
Pretty amazing.
That was right from Google Earth. There's a little almost little images like you would walk through Street View type thing. There's an image right on that monument in Google Earth. So it looks like it's only about a mile. Well, a mile hike, kind of on an ATV trail type thing, but you can drive in from the road maybe a mile or so. Oh, maybe 3/4 of a mile and then about a mile hike up to the monument, it looks like.
I'll
Yeah,
get up there someday. I need to see that.
yeah, it's a cool monument. Anybody got any
It's
more?
like trying to find a,
Go ahead.
no, go ahead. Just,
No, yeah, I was
I was
just
just
gonna
gonna
say,
say it's going to these points, when you're doing a book, it's like going to von Schmidt's grave marker. It sits, I don't know if you read what I showed that picture, all it says is a pioneer. It gives us the years.
Yeah.
But all that he did. And but I think in 1906, after the big earthquake, the city was not in a position to take much note of the fact that so rapidly after that he died. They were dealing with a lot. So yeah, he kind of faded away.
one of the things you had said at the camp out was all of his records had gotten lost in that fire.
Well, yeah, not all, but I mean,
most,
there are
yeah,
some things,
most,
obviously, but
yeah.
thank goodness he was making reports that were saved and we're not there in San Francisco. But yeah, a lot of this correspondence and all would have been really interesting. I have a few letters somehow survived, letters to other family members who kept them, and all.
So where is your book available at?
Anywhere where books are sold, it could be available. It may not be on a shelf. It's available at Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and can be ordered. I don't sell books myself on via my website. That's just information, but the information about the book, including the ISBN, is at my website, which is davidcarlebooks.com. So, but you could find it. Most any bookstore could do the search and get it, or people can reach out to me and I could, if you can't find it any other way, I could probably, we could work together on getting books out. Sold a few at the camp out last week. That was nice.
That's right. That's right. Steve, I just threw in the link to the Amazon.
Okay,
if you wanted to click on that, so you can have it delivered tomorrow, at least to my house anyway.
Real quick. Yes.
That's awesome.
How far away? I know there's people here from Nevada, but I mean, we don't really get to know who's in this audience here. Just away from where we are out here in the Western states.
I know. Anybody want to? You can either throw it in the chat or you can unmute. But David's kind of looking to see where his audience was. Yeah, that Michigan for Cindy.
I'm in Reno.
Okay. Yeah,
I'm in Fallon.
Tim, where are you at?
Now he's in Idaho.
Bakersfield, California.
Okay.
Fairfax. Okay. Back in Virginia is where those archives were that I was working with on this.
There you go. So you got San Diego. Tim said he was in Bakersfield. Another Virginia. That's awesome.
Great.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, if nobody has any more questions, I'll let you get going. I appreciate the time, David. It's fascinating.
Thanks for an excellent presentation, David.
Yeah, it's a good one. He did it.
Thank
you. He did another book that I want him to come on, and he traveled the 38th parallel all the way around all the way around the world. And so, not huge survey related, but just a fascinating story that I want David to kind of come back, and him and his wife wrote that book together. So, here in the next, we'll find some time in the next couple of months, David, to have you come back on and do that one, because that'll be a good one. So
that's published by the University of California Press.
Gotcha.
All right. Well,
awesome. All right, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good week.
Appreciate it.
Have a good week. Thanks, David. Bye, everyone.